An ordinary farmer was plowing his field when suddenly his plow hit something huge. A rusty anchor with a heavy chain appeared from the ground. When he decided to follow it to the end, his face turned pale. Subscribe to the channel and write where you're watching this video from. The land stretched wide and quiet under the pale morning sky, a sea of grass that swayed in the cool wind, dotted with patches of stubborn weeds that had claimed the soil for themselves over decades of neglect. To most who passed along the dirt road at the edge of the property, the place looked unremarkable, another piece of forgotten farmland left to the mercy of seasons. But to Malcolm Johnson, every ridge of earth, every tilt and fence post, every rod and beam of the old barn meant something deeper. This was the land of his father and grandfather before him, ground that had soaked up their sweat, their labor, their mistakes, and their persistence. It was his inheritance, not of wealth, but of duty. And though others in town mocked him for clinging to what they considered barren acres, Malcolm believed that if he let it go, he would be severing the last living tie to the people who made him who he was. The farmhouse itself had stood longer than Malcolm had been alive, its white paint peeling into pale gray, its porch sagging under the weight of years, its windows rattling whenever the wind pushed too hard against the boards. The barn to the east was worse, its doors crooked, its red paint long ago washed into something the color of rust. Around them, the fields were uneven, some places rich with black soil, others choked with stones and wild growth that seemed to rise up overnight. When he was a child, he remembered his father pointing to that far corner of the land, the part where trees pressed close together and the ground sloped in an awkward dip, and saying, "That's the section the earth itself doesn't want us to touch." His father never explained why. He only shook his head when Malcolm asked questions and returned to his work. Now, years later, Malcolm found himself steering his battered tractor toward that same neglected corner, the place where the weeds grew tallest and briars snared the ankles of anyone foolish enough to walk through them. He had cleared most of the other fields over time, slow but steady, and each season he felt a measure of pride in seeing corn rise in rows or soybeans turn golden in autumn light. But the overgrown section still remained, a scar of wasted earth. Every time he looked at it, he felt as though he had failed to claim all that was his. The neighbors had their opinions, too, and none of them subtle. Old men in the general store laughed into their coffee cups, calling his land cursed. Some whispered stories about strange noises, about sounds of chains clanking in the middle of the night when the wind carried just right. Younger farmers told him he was wasting his life fighting against soil that would never bear fruit. But Malcolm had always carried his father's stubbornness like a second skin. He could not ignore what was his, and he would not let idle talk guide him. He remembered the stories his grandfather told him on summer nights, sitting on the porch in the flickering glow of a lantern, tales of pride, of how a man had to respect his land even when it gave him nothing, because the land was patient and memory was long. His grandfather had spoken of the farm as if it were a living creature, one that watched how its caretakers behaved and rewarded only those who endured. Those words, half superstition and half wisdom, had sunk deep into Malcolm's bones. So that morning he decided. He would not let that last piece of neglected soil stand as a monument to failure. He would tear away the thorn bushes, drag out the roots, and turn the land over until it was bare and waiting for seed. It would take weeks, maybe months, but the thought of it filled him with a grim satisfaction. He would bring life back to what had been abandoned, and in doing so, honor the memory of those who came before him. Malcolm climbed down from the tractor to survey the stretch ahead. The air smelled of damp earth and wildflowers crushed underfoot. He ran his hand over the rough bark of a crooked oak that stood like a sentry at the edge of the field. His father had once tied a rope swing there, and Malcolm, as a boy, had flown through the summer air with laughter on his lips, never imagining how heavy the years would grow on his shoulders. Now, that same oak seemed to lean toward him, as if guarding the secrets that slept beneath its roots. For a fleeting moment, a chill crossed his skin, though the sun was climbing. He shook it off, telling himself it was only the memory of those childhood warnings echoing in his mind. He worked through the day, sweat soaking his shirt, his hands blistered from pulling stubborn stalks free, his back aching from bending and lifting. The soil resisted him, clinging to its weeds like a miser hoarding coins. Each swing of the scythe sent showers of brittle stalks flying. Each shove of the shovel revealed tangles of roots twisted deep into the ground, reluctant to surrender. But Malcolm pressed on. He thought of his father, his grandfather, the men who had stood here before him. Their ghosts seemed to hover at the edges of his sight, urging him to keep going, to prove that their legacy was not wasted. As the sun set and the light bled into a dark amber glow, Malcolm leaned against the tractor and looked out across a half-cleared section. It was not yet what he wanted, but progress was visible. For the first time in years, he could imagine this land transformed, the weeds gone, the soil rich again, rows of corn rising where only thorns had grown. His chest swelled with a quiet pride, though fatigue dragged at his limbs. That night, he sat on the porch with a glass of water, staring across the fields at the shadowy corner he had begun to reclaim. The cicadas buzzed in the trees, and the air carried the scent of rain. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled low, a reminder that the sky still ruled over all human effort. He thought about the neighbors who had mocked him, the men in the store who whispered that the land was haunted, and he felt a flicker of defiance. Let them laugh, let them talk. This was his land, and he would uncover every inch of it until it yielded to his will. But as he sat there, another sound drifted across the night, faint but distinct. It was not the cry of insects, nor the rumble of thunder, nor the rustle of leaves. It was something metallic, a dull resonance carried on the wind, like the echo of iron dragged across stone. It came only once, then faded into silence. Malcolm frowned and rose to his feet, straining his ears, but the night gave him nothing more. He told himself it was imagination, fatigue, perhaps the groaning of old machinery in the barn settling into the cool of night. Yet a seed of unease took root in his thoughts. He pushed it aside, forcing himself to believe that tomorrow would bring only more labor, more clearing, more sweat. He would sleep, wake, and return to the field with renewed strength. But as he finally lay in bed, the echo of that metallic sound lingered in his mind, circling in the dark like a bird searching for a place to land. He turned on his side, closed his eyes tight, and tried to summon the memory of his father's voice telling him to respect the land. Respect was what he would give it. Yet respect, he thought as sleep crept over him, often meant uncovering what lay hidden, no matter how deeply the earth tried to keep it buried. The farm was his legacy, his burden, and his home, and though he did not yet know it, the earth beneath his fields carried a legacy of its own, forged in iron and rust, waiting for the day when someone stubborn enough, or perhaps foolish enough, would dig deep enough to set it free. The morning broke gray and heavy, clouds dragging low across the horizon, the kind of sky that warned of rain, but hesitated to deliver it. Malcolm rose before dawn, his body still aching from the previous day's labor, yet his resolve as firm as ever. The memory of the strange metallic echo that had unsettled him the night before clung stubbornly to his thoughts, though he told himself it must have been some trick of the wind. Still, he carried it with him as he walked across the damp grass, boots sinking slightly into the softened soil, towards the field that had become his battlefield. Today, he intended to push deeper into that resistant corner, to tear away more of what had been abandoned for decades. He believed the land would finally yield to his effort. The tractor coughed and roared as he turned the ignition, the machine grumbling like an old beast reluctant to wake. Malcolm guided it carefully along the uneven ground, the plow biting into the soil, overturning clumps of earth that had not seen daylight for years. Each rotation of the engine filled the air with noise and vibration, masking the quiet sounds of the countryside. He leaned forward, focused, his eyes trained on the stubborn weeds that rose in thick clusters ahead. The blade of the plow caught them, slicing their roots, dragging them out with soil clinging like old secrets. Progress was steady, though hard-won, and Malcolm felt the familiar rhythm of labor seep into his bones, almost soothing in its repetition. Then, without warning, the plow jolted violently, the tractor shuddering as though it had collided with a wall hidden beneath the ground. Malcolm gripped the wheel hard, his heart leaping, his mind racing through possibilities. Stone, stump, perhaps some piece of old machinery left by his father long ago. He cut the engine, silence crashing down around him with an almost deafening weight, broken only by the ticking of cooling metal. Climbing down, he surveyed the spot where the machine had snagged. The soil bulged unnaturally, as though something enormous lurked just beneath the surface. He crouched and dug with his hands at first, tossing clumps of dirt aside. Within moments, his fingers struck something cold and unyielding. Clearing more, he exposed a surface not like stone at all, but of corroded metal, streaked with rust the color of dried blood. He paused, staring, before fetching his shovel and attacking the earth with urgent strokes. The shape began to emerge slowly, resisting him with its size and weight, until finally the outline grew undeniable. A fluke, curved and massive, revealed itself, an anchor, larger than anything he had ever seen, half buried like a relic from another world. Malcolm sat back, breathless, sweat dripping down his temples despite the cool air. His mind stumbled over the impossibility of it. An anchor belonged to the sea, to ships that ruled distant waters, not to this inland farm, surrounded by fields and forests hundreds of miles from the nearest coast. He ran his hand over the pitted surface, feeling the roughness of decades, maybe centuries of decay. The sheer size of it dwarfed him. This was no decorative piece, no fragment carried by accident. It was the kind of anchor meant for giants of iron and steel. From its shank extended a chain, each link as thick as his forearm, disappearing back into the earth where his plow could not reach. He followed it with his eyes, noting the way it dove downward, swallowed by soil as though the land itself were trying to keep it hidden. His stomach tightened with a strange mixture of awe and dread. The sound he had heard the night before returned to his memory, the metallic groan carried on the wind, and he wondered if it had come from this very thing, stirring after decades of silence. He fetched more tools, working for hours to expose a greater stretch of the chain, but it only led deeper, threading itself beneath the ground as if pointing him toward some unseen end. The more he uncovered, the heavier the weight on his mind grew. It was not just a curiosity, it was a question that refused to be ignored. How had an anchor found its way here? Who had brought it? For what purpose had it been left to rot beneath farmland? When he paused for rest, he sat on the edge of the pit he had dug, staring down at the relic. The silence of the fields pressed close, broken only by the occasional call of a crow overhead. He tried to reason through possibilities. Could it have been hauled here by men long ago, discarded from some transportation or salvage? But the size of it defied such logic. No wagon, no truck from his father's time could have carried this weight across such distance. And if it had been abandoned, why here? Why buried so carefully, with the chain disappearing like a trail leading elsewhere? The sky darkened by mid-afternoon, rain threatening but holding back, as though the heavens themselves waited to see what he would do next. Malcolm felt a stubborn determination take hold of him. He had started to clear this land out of duty, but now he was bound to it by mystery. He could not walk away, not when the earth had given up something so strange, so impossible. He had to know where the chain led, what story it told beneath his fields. He stood, brushing dirt from his hands, and looked across the stretch of land that remained untouched. The anchor was not the end of this discovery, but the beginning. The chain disappeared toward the tree line, toward the darker corners of his farm. He felt its pull as surely as if the iron links were wrapped around his own chest. He would follow it. He would tear away the soil, foot by foot, until the earth surrendered its secret. That night, when he returned to the house, exhaustion weighed on him, but his mind raced with restless energy. The anchor filled his thoughts, vast and immovable, an artifact out of place and out of time. He could not help but imagine the ship it must have belonged to, the waves that had once borne it, the storms that had tested it. How had it journeyed from sea to soil? The questions gnawed at him, keeping him awake long after the crickets began their night chorus. Lying in bed, he thought again of his father's words about respecting the land, about how the earth held memories. He wondered if this was what his father had meant all along, if he had known something of the secret beneath the soil but never dared to unearth it. The idea seemed absurd, and yet it clung to him, refusing to release him into sleep. When rest finally came, it was filled with dreams of chains stretching endlessly, links that dragged across the ground with a sound like thunder, pulling him forward toward something hidden in shadows. He woke before dawn, heart pounding, drenched in sweat, with the certainty that he could not ignore the anchor. He would rise again, he would dig deeper, and he would follow that iron trail wherever it led, no matter what truth lay waiting at the other end. The following morning dawned clearer than the one before, though the sky held a thin veil of mist that clung to the fields and blurred the tree line in the distance. Malcolm rose before the sun, pulled on the same worn boots and work shirt still stiff with dried sweat and earth, and moved out across the damp grass toward the place where the anchor sat half exposed like the tooth of some ancient beast. He had slept poorly, dreams plagued by the sight of chains stretching forever into darkness, their clinking echoing through his skull until he woke with the sheets twisted around his body. Yet that restless night had only sharpened his determination. The mystery had claimed him now. He would not let it go until he understood where that trail of iron links led and why such a thing had been buried in his land. The anchor looked different in daylight. The rising sun caught its jagged edges, highlighting the corrosion and the moss that clung stubbornly to the pits of its surface. The chain stretched out from it like a vein, plunging into the earth where his digging had ended the previous evening. Malcolm stood over it, shovel in hand, and felt the same sense of weight pressing on his chest as before. It was as if the chain itself were calling to him, commanding him to follow, to unearth whatever lay hidden beyond. He set the shovel into the soil and began to dig again, each thrust of the blade bringing him closer to something he could not yet imagine. The work was brutal. The ground was dense and riddled with roots, some so thick he had to hack through them with an axe before he could move forward. At times, he resorted to his hands, clawing the dirt away from each iron link like a man trying to rescue something alive. The chain seemed endless. Every time he thought he had reached a point where it might stop, where perhaps it had been cut or broken off, it revealed itself again, burrowed deeper into the ground or snaking sideways toward the tree line. The soil stained his clothes, filled his boots, crusted under his nails, but he hardly noticed. Hours slipped by in a haze of labor. By midday his body was slick with sweat, his muscles screaming from exertion. He fetched water from the house, but he drank quickly and returned at once to his work. The obsession had set its hooks in him. He no longer thought of this as simple curiosity. It had become a need, as essential as hunger or breath. The chain led somewhere, and he could not rest until he saw the end. The plow and shovel were not enough. He realized he needed greater force if he was to make progress, and so by evening he had driven into town to rent an old excavator from a man who specialized in clearing lots. The machine was rough and rattled when it moved, but it was strong, and Malcolm knew it would allow him to dig deeper and faster than he could manage alone. The next day, the roar of the excavator filled the fields. Its wide arm scooped away great hunks of soil, exposing stretches of the chain that gleamed faintly under the dirt despite their rusted surfaces. Malcolm guided it carefully, afraid of breaking the links, though each one seemed indestructible in its weight and thickness. The deeper he dug, the more unsettled he became. The links were not merely lying beneath the ground. They were embedded as if they had been dragged and swallowed by the earth itself. In some places, the chain dove so far down he could not see its bottom even with the machine, and he had to dig trenches alongside it to follow its course. Day after day, he repeated this work. His farm chores fell behind, the animals went unfed until late, his crops ignored. Neighbors began to talk when they saw the machine on his land, its iron arm clawing into the soil like some relentless predator. They asked what he was doing, but Malcolm offered no answers. He only wiped the dirt from his brow and returned to the chain. They shook their heads and muttered that he was losing himself, that the land had finally broken him, but he no longer cared. What lay beneath the soil was larger than crops or fences or the approval of those who laughed at him. At night, exhaustion claimed his body but not his mind. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, seeing only the chain, stretching on, refusing to end. In his dreams, he followed it through tunnels of earth that closed in around him, the air thick and choking, until he reached a place where shadows towered and the ground trembled with some buried weight. He always woke before he saw what waited there, his chest pounding, sweat cold on his skin. And yet, the next morning, he returned, drawn back as though the chain itself had a will and he was no more than its servant. The further he followed the links, the stranger it seemed. At one point, the excavator revealed a section of chain that curved upward, breaking through the soil before plunging down again, as though it had been dragged along the surface before sinking back into the ground. The earth there was scarred. Even after decades, the soil discolored in long streaks as if scorched or crushed beneath impossible weight. He knelt in that trench, running his hands over the grooves, and felt certain that something had once moved here, something massive and alive with force. It was no accident. Someone or something had tried to pull the anchor across his land. But for what reason? And to what end? As the days blurred into one another, Malcolm's body grew leaner, his eyes sunken, but his determination only hardened. He began marking the path of the chain with stakes, following its winding trail across the fields and towards the shadowed edge of the woods. It was not a straight line, but a serpentine course, weaving as though resisting or fighting some obstacle. Each step brought him closer to the tree line, where the ground dipped toward a part of his farm that he had seldom walked. That place had always been too wild, too overgrown, and his father had told him it was not worth the trouble. Now, Malcolm understood there had been another reason behind that warning, though his father had never spoken it. The work consumed him so thoroughly that he forgot the world beyond his land. He forgot the mocking voices of his neighbors, the bills waiting on the kitchen table, even the ache in his muscles. His world had narrowed to the trench before him and the dark line of chain that pulled him forward. He felt as though he had been chosen for this, that the land had waited for him alone to uncover what it had swallowed. It was a dangerous thought, one that left him uneasy when he admitted it to himself, but he could not shake it. One evening, as the sun burned low and the fields glowed orange, he stood at the edge of the trench and looked at the line of iron that disappeared into the trees. The anchor was far behind him now, a relic left exposed like the gateway to this obsession. Ahead lay only mystery, shadow, and the promise of something vast. He wiped his hands on his jeans, breathing heavily, and realized he no longer had a choice. The chain had become his master. Tomorrow he would follow it into the woods. Tomorrow he would see where it truly led. And though the night was still and the air calm, he thought he heard it then. A faint sound carried on the breeze, the metallic groan of links pulled taut, as if the chain itself shifted beneath the soil in answer to his resolve. He froze, listening, but the fields held their silence. Yet the echo remained in his chest, pulsing like a heartbeat not his own. It followed him all the way back to the house and into uneasy dreams, where the chain gleamed in the dark like a serpent waiting to strike. The forest stood like a dark wall at the edge of Malcolm's property, the place where the chain had vanished beneath a curtain of tangled roots and stubborn brush. For days he had pushed his excavator as far as he dared, cutting a path through the earth until the trees made further work impossible. Beyond that point, the links disappeared under the soil, swallowed whole, yet he felt their presence as if the iron still hummed beneath his boots. He could no longer ignore the weight of his ignorance. Digging alone would not give him the answers he needed. The anchor and the endless trail had shown themselves to him, but the story of how they had come to rest here, so far from the sea, was still hidden. If the land would not reveal it, perhaps time would. On a morning heavy with low clouds, Malcolm locked the door of his farmhouse and drove the cracked road into town. The library was an aging brick building whose steps sagged under years of storms and footsteps. He had not stepped inside since childhood, when his school had forced him to research forgotten wars and presidents he could hardly remember now. Yet, walking into the musty air, surrounded by rows of shelves bowed under the weight of neglected volumes, he felt a strange sense of reverence, as though he had entered another kind of field, one sown not with corn but with memory. The librarian, a thin woman with hair the color of smoke, raised her head from her desk and regarded him with a mixture of surprise and curiosity. He asked about local archives, anything that reached back to the 1940s. Without a word, she led him to a room at the back where yellowed newspapers and brittle county records slept inside long drawers of wood. He began with the year 1944, guided less by reason than by instinct. That year kept returning to him in the whispers of the old men at the store, in the fading stories he remembered from his grandfather's voice. Turning the fragile pages, he found reports of violent storms that had torn through the region, storms so fierce that telegraph lines had fallen and roads had been washed into gullies. There were notes of strange sightings near the coast, of lights flashing in the sky when the clouds split, of thunder that shook the hills like cannon fire. One article mentioned the disappearance of a freighter, its name blacked out as though even in newsprint it could not be spoken. The paper called it a matter of naval concern and offered no further detail. Malcolm leaned closer, reading and rereading the brief passage. A ship had been lost, a storm had raged, and only a few counties away, in the land that now belonged to him, people claimed to hear noises they could not explain. He closed his eyes, hearing again the groan of iron on stone that had haunted him in the night. Could it be that the anchor in his field belonged to that missing ship? Could the chain that pulled him forward be the last remnant of a vessel swallowed by the sea, yet tethered still to the land? The thought was absurd, but then so was the anchor itself. His search did not end with newspapers. He combed through county deeds, maps yellowed with age, handwritten ledgers recording land sales and boundary disputes. On one map, dated 1939, he saw his property marked as little more than wilderness, its edges drawn with careless lines. Yet, in the margin, an ink note caught his attention. Unsettled ground. Avoid cultivation. The words were faint, the handwriting rushed, but the meaning clear. Someone long ago had recognized that corner of the farm as different, untouchable. Whether they knew what lay beneath or merely sensed it, Malcolm could not guess. He left the library with a folder of copies under his arm, but his hunger for answers only deepened. The following evening, he drove to the home of Mr. Hollis, one of the oldest men in the county, a figure as weathered as the rocking chair on his porch. The old man greeted him with suspicion at first, but when Malcolm mentioned the storms of '44, the anchor, and the chain, Hollis's eyes sharpened with a light that belied his years. He invited Malcolm to sit and poured 2 glasses of amber liquor that smelled of smoke and age. Then, in a voice rough as gravel, he began to tell his own story. Hollis remembered that storm as if it had happened yesterday. He spoke of skies black as tar, winds that bent trees to the ground, and a sound unlike thunder rolling through the hills. "It was metal," he whispered, "metal screaming, like a train tearing itself apart." He said that for days after, the people of the county heard noises in the woods, chains dragging, engines grinding, though no trucks were seen on the roads. Some claimed they saw lights flashing through the trees at night, as if search lamps were cutting through the darkness. The older folks told children to stay away from the forest, to never go near that ground again. Most obeyed. But Hollis admitted that he had wandered close once, not far from where Malcolm's farm now stood. He had seen shapes half buried in the mud, beams of steel jutting like broken bones, and men in uniforms working by lantern light. When he returned the next day, the place was deserted, the shapes gone as if swallowed whole. Malcolm listened without speaking, the liquor untouched in his glass. The old man's words matched the rhythm of his own discovery, as though 2 halves of a puzzle were finally meeting. He asked Hollis if anyone ever discovered what had truly happened. The man shook his head, his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond his porch. "The war swallowed everything," he said. "Ships, men, secrets, some things they didn't want us to know. Maybe they still don't." That night, Malcolm returned home with the weight of stories pressing against him as heavily as the chain pressed against the soil. He spread the papers across his kitchen table, studying the headlines until his eyes blurred. The freighter lost in the storm, the notes on unsettled ground, the whispers of chains in the forest. All of it pointed toward something hidden, something vast. He wondered if the men Hollis had seen in uniforms had tried to drag the anchor inland, to salvage what they could from a wreck no one was meant to find. Perhaps they had failed, leaving only fragments behind. Perhaps more than fragments. The farmhouse was silent, but the silence felt crowded. Malcolm looked toward the window, where the moon hung low over the fields. He imagined the anchor gleaming faintly in that cold light, its chain stretching toward the woods like a command. The stories had not frightened him away. They had bound him tighter. Now he knew that he was not chasing a dream or losing his mind. Others had heard it. Others had seen glimpses of what lay hidden. He was not the first to stand on this trail, though he might be the only one left to follow it to the end. As he extinguished the lamp and let the house fall into darkness, he felt the pull once more. Tomorrow he would clear the path into the woods. Tomorrow he would step where the chain led, into the heart of the land his father had warned him to avoid. And though he tried to quiet his racing thoughts with the memory of his grandfather's words about respecting the earth, he could not deny the truth burning inside him. The earth remembered, and now it was calling him deeper into its memory, toward a secret that refused to stay buried. The next morning arrived with a clarity that felt almost unnatural. The sky scrubbed clean after a night of restless wind that had moaned across the fields like a warning. Malcolm had not slept much, his mind turning endlessly over the fragments of history he had uncovered and the stories he had drawn from Hollis's memory. The freighter lost to the storm, the soldiers glimpsed in the woods, the dragging of chains across soil. These things no longer felt like myth. They were threads, frayed but real, leading him toward a truth buried deeper than his plow could cut. As the first light spread across the farm, gilding the grass and the sagging barn with faint fire, he knew the time had come to step beyond the fields he had claimed and into the woods his father had always avoided. The chain led him there, its path marked by trenches and stakes, a scar across his land that grew darker with each day of digging. It vanished beneath the gnarled roots and thickets at the boundary, swallowed whole by a wilderness that had grown unchecked for generations. That edge had always seemed impenetrable to him, a wall of brambles, oak, and sycamore knotted together by vines thick as rope. He remembered, with sudden sharpness, being a boy and asking his father why they never ventured past those trees. The answer had been short, almost harsh. "There's nothing there you need to see." At the time, Malcolm had obeyed, but standing there now with a shovel in his hands and sweat already beading on his forehead, he realized his father had known something and chosen silence. The first day in the woods was consumed with clearing. He hacked at brush with a machete he had borrowed years ago and never returned, each stroke scattering leaves and twigs that smelled sharp and green in the air. The ground was uneven, falling into shallow dips and rising suddenly into ridges where roots thrust upward like knuckles through the soil. The deeper he pushed, the thicker the silence became. The songs of birds fell away. The chatter of insects dulled. It was as though the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for him to trespass fully. His boots sank into moss in places, slid across slick stone in others, but he kept moving forward, cutting, tearing, sweating, until the edge of a ravine revealed itself. It appeared suddenly, a break in the earth where the trees bent back and sunlight spilled in harsh beams. The ravine was not deep, perhaps 20 feet, but its sides were jagged and cluttered with rocks that looked black even under the sun. At its bottom lay a scatter of debris half hidden by ferns and vines. From above, it looked like nothing more than fallen timber, perhaps the remnants of storms long past. But Malcolm's heart seized at the shapes. There was geometry there, too straight to be the work of wind or water. Angles jutted upward where wood would have splintered. A curve arched like the side of a hull, though broken and crumpled by time. He climbed down carefully, the loose soil sliding beneath his boots. The air grew cooler as he descended, dampness clinging to his skin. At the bottom, he approached the debris, pushing vines aside to reveal surfaces pitted and brown. His hand brushed metal, not wood, iron scarred with rust, eaten by decades of rain and soil. A beam lay twisted like a child's toy, thick enough that he could barely wrap his arms around it. Another section protruded at an angle, curved and riveted, unmistakably part of a larger structure. Malcolm stepped back, breath caught in his throat as the realization took shape. This was not storm-fallen wreckage or some farmer's forgotten equipment. This was the skeleton of a ship, entombed in a ravine miles from the nearest ocean. The silence deepened. Even the wind seemed to falter. He walked slowly around the fragments, tracing the lines of the hull with his eyes. In places, he could see faint lettering barely visible through rust and moss, though the words had been devoured by time, leaving only impressions of what once might have named the vessel. The chain made sense now. The anchor in his field, the endless links dragging across the land, they had not been abandoned randomly. They belonged here, tethered once to this colossal carcass hidden in the woods. He dropped to his knees beside one of the beams and pressed his palm against its surface. The iron was rough and cool, but in that moment it seemed alive, thrumming with the memory of storms and battles, of men shouting above waves. He tried to imagine how it had come to rest here, and the thought bent the edges of his reason. Had the storm Hollis spoke of been strong enough to drive a ship inland? Impossible. Had men attempted to disassemble it, to carry it away piece by piece, only to abandon their task when the weight proved too much? Perhaps, yet the size of the wreckage suggested it had never truly left. It had been swallowed by the land, left to rust and sleep beneath roots and vines. As he explored further, Malcolm found more evidence of deliberate effort. Tools lay scattered in the undergrowth, handles long rotted but metal heads intact. A rusted lantern lay half buried, its glass shattered, its frame bent. Near the base of one large section of hull, he uncovered the remnants of a canvas tarp, stiff with decay, but clearly once used to cover or conceal. Whoever had been here before him had not stumbled upon this by accident. They had tried to hide it. The discovery rattled him as much as the wreck itself. Who had come here? The men in uniforms Hollis had seen. Soldiers sent to retrieve something from the ship, to erase its existence. And why had they left so suddenly? Their tools abandoned, their work unfinished. Malcolm imagined them laboring under lantern light, the sound of chains dragging through the trees until something forced them away. The thought sent a chill crawling across his skin. The sun dipped lower, shadows stretching across the ravine. Malcolm climbed back to the edge, his clothes torn and his body aching, but his mind ablaze. He stood at the tree line looking out over his farm, the trench that cut across his field visible even at this distance, leading like an arrow straight to this place. Everything connected now, the anchor, the chain, the storm of 44, the whispers of men working in the night. His farm was not simply his inheritance. It was the grave of history, a place where secrets had been buried deliberately and left for the earth to guard. As he walked home, the weight of the discovery pressed down on him. His father's warnings echoed with new meaning, as though the silence had been protection, not indifference. The legacy Malcolm had thought was nothing more than soil and sweat was far larger, far darker. And yet, as much as fear gnawed at him, he felt something else rising stronger: resolve. He could not stop now. The wreck in the ravine was only part of the story. Whatever truth lay behind it had been hidden for a reason, and he would uncover it, even if it meant losing himself in the process. That night, the house felt smaller, its walls crowding around him. He lay awake, listening to the ticking of the old clock and the groaning of beams in the wind. But beneath it all, he thought he heard the faintest echo of metal shifting in the woods. He closed his eyes and pictured the ravine, the wreckage sleeping in the dark, and knew with a certainty as heavy as iron that his journey had only just begun. The days that followed Malcolm's journey into the ravine blurred together into one long stretch of unrest. Each morning he returned to the place where the earth had torn itself open, where the twisted bones of a ship lay tangled among roots and stone. He climbed down again and again, brushing away vines, prying at rusted surfaces, following the curve of broken hull and shattered beams until his body ached and his hands were blistered raw. He no longer thought of planting his fields or repairing his fences. Those tasks seemed trivial in the shadow of what he had unearthed. The farm had always been his world, but now it was only the stage for something far larger, something that reached beyond his own name and blood. It was not long before he realized he could no longer keep the discovery to himself. At first, he resisted the thought, fearful that outsiders would arrive and claim what he had found, fearful that the land would be taken from him entirely. But the wreckage was too vast, too undeniable. It deserved more than his own solitary digging. One night, sitting at his kitchen table with the yellowed copies of newspaper clippings spread out before him, he admitted the truth to himself. The freighter lost in the storm of 1944, the anchor buried in his field, the chain leading like a path to the ravine. This was not his secret alone. It belonged to history, and history demanded witnesses. The call he placed to the county office was brief and awkward. He explained only that he had found remnants of a structure in his woods, metal that did not belong there. The woman on the other end of the line sounded skeptical, but by the next day a pair of local officials arrived in a dusty truck to see for themselves. Malcolm led them into the trees, down into the ravine, and watched their faces shift from casual disinterest to wide-eyed astonishment as they stood among the rusted wreckage. They asked questions he could not answer, touched the iron with hands that trembled slightly, and one of them muttered that this was beyond their authority. Within a week, the news had spread. Cars and trucks began to arrive at the edge of his property, men and women in neat clothes stepping out with notebooks, cameras, and measuring tools. They introduced themselves as historians, archaeologists, representatives from the state university. Some carried the gravity of professors, their voices heavy with certainty, while others moved with the restless energy of students desperate to be the first to uncover some forgotten fact. Malcolm watched them descend into the ravine, watched them trace the beams and rivets, heard them speak in terms he barely understood: displacement, tonnage, maritime registry, wartime logistics. To him, it was still a wreck hidden in his woods, but to them it was a revelation. The experts soon agreed on one point: the wreckage belonged to a World War II freighter, the kind used to carry heavy supplies across the Atlantic during the years when the world was torn apart. Its presence so far inland defied explanation, but the storm of 1944 returned again and again in their conversations. They speculated that the ship had been driven off course, perhaps forced into the cove by the gale, smashed against the cliffs, and left to sink in shallower waters. From there, perhaps, salvage crews had attempted to recover its anchor, dragging it across the land until the weight broke their equipment and left it stranded in what would later become Malcolm's Field. Others whispered more daring theories that the ship had carried something too valuable to leave behind, something hidden that required secrecy and silence, explaining why its loss had been buried in archives and its name erased from memory. Malcolm listened, but said little. He felt like a ghost on his own land, watching strangers swarm over the soil that had once been his alone. Yet there was pride, too, swelling in his chest as he realized the magnitude of what he had uncovered. Reporters came with their cameras, snapping photographs of the anchor still lying in the trench, of the chain that cut across the fields like a scar. They tried to interview him, thrusting microphones in his face, but he found himself unable to put his feelings into words. He had not set out to make history. He had only wanted to clear the land, and yet now the farm had become a place of pilgrimage, where men and women came to touch the iron bones of a past the world had nearly forgotten. One evening, after the crowd had dispersed and the sun sank low over the horizon, Malcolm stood alone at the edge of the ravine. The ship's remains lay quiet beneath him, shrouded in shadow, yet it seemed to radiate a presence stronger than ever. He thought of the men who had once sailed her, of the storm that had claimed her, of the desperate attempts to salvage what they could before the forest swallowed her whole. He imagined the uniforms Hollis had seen, the lanterns glowing in the night, the chains clattering as they fought against the impossible weight. And he wondered what had driven them away, leaving their work unfinished. Had they been ordered to abandon it? Had they discovered something aboard that terrified them into silence? The historians argued over such questions, but no one could provide answers. The official reports had been scrubbed clean, the ship's records missing or sealed away. Theories multiplied, yet facts remained elusive. What was undeniable was the historical value of the site. Within days, the state declared both the anchor and the wreckage protected property, a heritage site that would be studied and preserved. For Malcolm, the declaration was a strange mixture of triumph and loss. His discovery was recognized, honored even, but it was no longer his. The land that had once been his inheritance was now claimed by history itself. Still, he felt a quiet satisfaction when he looked at the anchor glinting faintly in the moonlight, the chain stretching across the earth like a testament to his stubbornness. Others might have walked past it, dismissed the jolt of the plow as nothing more than stone, but he had dug, and he had followed, and in doing so, he had unearthed a secret the world had tried to forget. The experts could debate, and the officials could take their notes, but the truth of that discovery belonged to him. It was his hands that had broken the soil, his sweat that had cleared the path, his resolve that had carried him into the woods. As the night deepened and the voices of strangers faded into memory, Malcolm returned to his farmhouse, the boards creaking beneath his boots. He sat once more at the kitchen table, the clippings and maps still spread before him, and traced the lines of his land with a calloused finger. He understood now that his inheritance had been more than soil and timber. It had been a story waiting to be told, a secret buried for decades, demanding a man stubborn enough to dig it free. Whether it brought him ruin or recognition, he could not yet know. But as he sat in the quiet, listening to the faint groan of wind through the rafters, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. The land had spoken, and he had answered. The weeks that followed the declaration of the site as state property were unlike anything Malcolm had ever experienced in his life. His quiet farm, which had once been defined only by the steady rhythm of planting and harvest, had become a place of constant intrusion. Trucks arrived daily, carrying equipment and men in uniforms who marked off sections of his land with stakes and bright plastic tape. Scholars returned in greater numbers, their voices echoing in the ravine as they debated each new piece of rusted metal unearthed. Journalists stood at the end of his dirt road with cameras, eager for another photograph of the solitary farmer who had stumbled upon a relic of war. For a time, he tolerated it. He watched them come and go, listened to their talk, even felt a measure of pride when he overheard one of the professors call the discovery a once-in-a-lifetime historical revelation. Yet the pride was mixed with something bitter. Each day the land seemed to slip further from his grasp until he no longer recognized it as his own. Malcolm found himself withdrawing from the visitors. He stopped answering questions, stopped walking down into the ravine with them, stopped standing beside the anchor when they snapped their photographs. Instead, he worked in the other fields, tending to the tasks that had always grounded him, mending fences, patching the roof of the barn, feeding animals that bleated hungrily when the scholars forgot they existed. Yet, even these duties felt hollow. Wherever he went, he could not escape the presence of the anchor and its chain, stretching across his soil like a scar that would never heal. The land no longer belonged to him, but neither did it belong fully to the historians and officials who catalogued it. It belonged to itself, to history, to something far older and heavier than any single man. Neighbors who had once mocked him now came by his gate, not with jeers but with curiosity. Some congratulated him as if he had won a prize, though he had gained no reward for what he had uncovered. Others envied him, whispering that he must be hiding riches, that the state would never have taken the site unless treasure lay buried in the wreck. Malcolm met their words with silence. He had no riches to show them, no treasure to claim. The officials had made that clear. The ship and everything within it were state property, untouchable. He had signed documents that stripped him of any legal right to profit from what he had found. All he had left was the memory of the first moment he touched the iron surface, the first moment he realized the land had chosen him to reveal its secret. At night, when the trucks had gone and the ravine lay silent once more, Malcolm would walk to the edge of the field and stand where the chain disappeared into the earth. The moonlight turned the rusted links silver, and the stillness of the night made them seem eternal. He would place a hand on the cold metal, feel in its roughness under his palm, and think of his father and grandfather. They had labored this soil without ever uncovering what lay beneath, or perhaps they had known and chosen to leave it undisturbed. He would never know for certain. But he felt that by following the chain, by uncovering the ship, he had fulfilled something that had lingered unspoken in his family's history. The farm was not merely land to be planted, it was a place that remembered, and he had been the one to listen. The recognition that came to him was not the kind of glory others imagined. Reporters wrote his name in newspapers, yes, and some even called him a hero of preservation. But the attention faded quickly as other stories claimed the headlines. The scholars stayed, the officials lingered, but the world moved on. When the noise quieted, Malcolm remained alone with his altered land, left to reconcile the pride of discovery with the emptiness it had brought. He had unearthed history, yet in doing so he had lost something more personal. He had lost the solitude of his farm, the simple ownership of his inheritance, the quiet certainty that the land was his and his alone. There were nights when he lay awake and thought about what else might be hidden within that wreck, deep within the shadows of the ravine where no archaeologist had yet reached. Hollis's words returned to him. Men in uniforms, lanterns burning, chains dragged through the dark before vanishing without explanation. What had they been searching for? Had they found it? Had they fled because of it? These questions gnawed at him, questions the state would not allow him to pursue. Sometimes he imagined slipping into the ravine under cover of darkness, prying open the rusted beams himself. But the thought always faded when he remembered the watchful eyes, the fences, the laws that now caged what had once been his secret. Still, he could not stop himself from wondering. Perhaps the ship had carried only supplies, crates of ammunition, fuel, canned food. But perhaps it had carried something else, something so dangerous or valuable that its disappearance had been buried deliberately. Gold, he thought sometimes, or experimental weapons. Other nights, he imagined documents, intelligence that had the power to change the war. Whatever the truth, it was locked away now, lost beneath decades of rust and bureaucracy. He had come closer to it than anyone alive, and yet it remained just out of reach, a shadow he could never grasp. In the end, he found a strange peace in acceptance. Standing at the edge of his field one evening, the sky painted in streaks of orange and violet, he looked at the anchor one last time and understood it not as a loss, but as a gift. He had been the one to reveal it, to draw history back into the light. The land had trusted him with its secret, and he had honored that trust by listening, by digging, by refusing to turn away even when reason told him to. Others might study the wreck, argue over it, claim it for themselves, but the moment of discovery, the raw awe of pulling earth away from iron and realizing what he had touched, that moment belonged to him alone. He walked back to the farmhouse as the sun sank, the fields whispering with the sound of wind through grass. The house creaked in its old bones, the porch sagged, the barn leaned, yet for the first time in weeks he felt no bitterness at their imperfection. They were his, as much as the memories of his father's voice and his grandfather's hands guiding his own. The land had shown him that even the quietest soil carried stories, that every field could hold a secret waiting for the stubborn and the faithful to unearth. He had paid a price for that knowledge, his solitude, his ownership, his peace, but it was a price he no longer regretted. As night fell and the first stars emerged, Malcolm stood at his porch and looked across the darkened fields. In the distance, the faint outline of the anchor rose against the horizon, its chain vanishing into shadow, a monument to both burden and revelation. He felt the weight of its presence, but also its truth. Some secrets were not meant to be owned. Some belonged to the world. His role had never been to keep it, but to find it. And though the story of the ship remained unfinished, though questions lingered like ghosts, he was content to let the earth keep its mysteries. He had uncovered enough to know that the past was never truly gone. It waited, patient and silent, beneath the soil, until someone like him was willing to listen. And so the farmer remained, a solitary figure standing against the vastness of his fields, carrying both the pride and the burden of what he had discovered. The chain no longer pulled him forward. It lay still now, quiet in the night, but he knew it would never leave him. Wherever he went, whatever work he turned his hands to, the memory of iron and rust and the impossible weight of history would remain with him. That was the true inheritance the land had given him, and it was enough. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next unbelievable story. Click to watch the next video right now. It's even more shocking than this one. And share this video with your friends. They won't believe what happened here until they see it themselves.